At just 19 years old, Clara Dalton found her life collapsing into a reality she had never imagined. Thrust into a forced marriage that left her trembling on the edge of a world she did not understand. Raised in a frontier town where rumors, prejudices, and fear shaped the stories told about the Apache people, Clara had grown up hearing only warnings, whispers of savagery, danger, and unforgiving men who stole what they wanted. So when the town council, desperate to secure peace after a year of mounting tensions, declared that Clara would be sent as a peace bride to an Apache warrior, she felt the ground disappear beneath her feet. Her protests meant nothing. The town needed a scapegoat, and Clara, with her quiet nature and lack of powerful family ties, was the easy choice. She spent the night before her departure unable to sleep, staring at the walls of her childhood home, trying to memorize the life she would be leaving behind, her thoughts racing with dread and the sharp sting of betrayal. The next morning, when she was led to the edge of the desert where the exchange would take place, the heat shimmered around her, blurring the line between the familiar and the unknown. There, waiting with an unreadable expression, stood the Apache warrior Koda. He was tall, broad-shouldered, with striking dark eyes that held a depth she could not decipher. He did not step forward to claim her, did not look at her with the cruelty she had expected. Instead, he stood still, quiet, as though he understood the storm she was caught in. Her town watched from a distance, some with relief, some with fear, and a few with thinly veiled glee that she would no longer be their concern. Clara's heart pounded painfully as she was nudged forward, every step feeling like a goodbye she had not chosen. The desert wind pulled at her hair, the scent of dust and sagebrush filling her lungs as she approached the man who would now control her fate. The elders announced the agreement without ceremony, their voices sharp and clipped. And then, just like that, Clara was no longer a daughter of the town. She was Koda's bride. She expected him to grab her arm or pull her toward his horse, to assert dominance, to live up to every terrifying story she had been told. But instead, Koda simply nodded once, slow and gentle, as if acknowledging her fear rather than dismissing it. He mounted his horse with fluid grace, then extended a hand, not forcing her, not dragging her, but offering her the choice to accept his help. Confused and shaken, Clara hesitated before placing her trembling hand in his. As he guided her up behind him, she felt her terror twist into something complicated and unfamiliar. She was heading into the unknown, certain that her life was ending rather than beginning. Little did she know that this man, this stranger, she feared would become the one person who would rewrite everything she thought she knew about the world, about herself, and about love. The journey to Koda's camp stretched out beneath the vast, unbroken sky, and though Clara's fear remained a tight knot in her chest, she soon noticed something strange. Koda made no effort to frighten her or assert ownership over her. He rode with a calm, steady presence, keeping his horse just close enough that she would not feel abandoned, yet far enough to give her space to breathe. Every movement he made was deliberate, quiet, as though he understood that any sudden gesture might cause her to shrink back. Clara found herself watching him with very curiosity, trying to read his intentions in the set of his shoulders or the angle of his gaze. She had expected hostility, indifference, or even a cruel triumph in claiming a bride forced into marriage. But instead she found a man who seemed to regard the world around him more than he regarded her. When they stopped for water, he offered her a flask without speaking, his eyes flickering away each time she met them, as if he were giving her the privacy she no longer possessed. The silence between them was not heavy or punishing, it was strangely respectful, and that unsettled her more than outright anger might have. By the time they reached the Apache camp, Clara's nerves returned with full force. She braced herself for rejection or harsh judgment, convinced the people would treat her as an outsider, a burden, or worse, a symbol of a treaty no one truly wanted. But to her surprise, the women approached her first, their expressions gentle, their gestures welcoming. One offered her cool water, another touched her arm softly, showing her where she could rest. Clara blinked in shock, unable to process such warmth from those she had been taught to fear. Koda stayed a few steps behind, watching without interfering, as though allowing her to find her own footing. Later, at the evening fire, when she sat alone, unsure of the customs and terrified of doing something wrong, Koda approached her with the same quiet steadiness he had shown all day. He didn't sit too close or try to force conversation. He simply crouched beside her and spoke for the first time since they had left her town. "You are safe here. For simple words, yet they hit her harder than a dozen promises. They weren't coated in warmth or affection. They didn't pretend to erase the harsh reality of how she had arrived here, but they were sincere. Real. And sincerity was something Clara had almost forgotten existed. That night, lying beneath a foreign sky, Clara expected nightmares. Instead, she kept replaying Koda's tone, low, steady, protective. Not because he was her husband by force, but because he seemed to believe in the weight of his word. She didn't trust him yet, not fully. But for the first time since the marriage had been forced upon her, something small and fragile stirred behind her fear, the unsettling beginning of curiosity, and the faintest flicker of hope that perhaps this man was not the monster she had been warned about. "You said." Clara's fear eased only slightly in the days that followed, but each sunrise brought something new, something that shook the foundations of everything she had been told about the Apache people, and most of all about the man she now called husband. Koda rose early each morning, long before the camp stirred, disappearing into the wilderness with quiet purpose. She once imagined he spent those hours planning how to control her, but instead she learned he was a hunter who brought back food for the elders, the widows, and the children before he ever thought of himself. He returned each day with something left just outside her tent, not with words or expectations, but with small, wordless offerings. One morning it was a handful of wild berries, carefully wrapped in a leaf so they wouldn't bruise. Another day it was a carved wooden feather, its edges smoothed with care. Once, it was a soft strip of warm, freshly tanned hide that he placed near her sleeping mat without ever entering her space. Clara didn't know whether these were traditional gestures, peace offerings, or simply his way of acknowledging her presence, but each one unsettled her in a strangely gentle way. She couldn't understand why a man who had every right by the standards of the treaty and the expectations of both their peoples to treat her as property instead chose to treat her with such careful restraint. The camp itself slowly became less terrifying as she observed its rhythms. Children played freely, weaving between the adults with laughter that reminded her of home. The women wove baskets and cooked over the fire, occasionally glancing her way with encouraging smiles, as if inviting her to join when she was ready. The men worked with quiet focus, their conversations low but filled with a sense of community she had rarely seen even in her own town. What surprised her most was the respect threaded through every interaction, respect for the land, for each other, and even for her. No one treated her like a foreign object or a burden. Instead, they moved around her with understanding, as though they sensed her trembling uncertainty and chose patience rather than judgment. And through it all, Koda maintained the same strange distance, never hovering, never demanding, but always present at the edge of her awareness. When she watched him from afar, she noticed how he moved with a stillness that spoke of deep thought, how he listened more than he spoke, how his people trusted him without question. It made her wonder what kind of man he truly was beneath the silence. Slowly, almost reluctantly, Clara found herself waiting for his return each afternoon, realizing that the sight of him stepping into camp brought an unexpected sense of relief. He didn't speak much to her, but the quiet moments when he met her gaze held something steady, something real. She didn't yet have the courage to call it kindness, but it was certainly not the cruelty she had been taught to expect. And as she lay awake at night, listening to the distant sounds of the desert, Clara realized that she was no longer only afraid. She was curious about the man whose world was beginning to make more sense than the one that had cast her away. That night, when the weight of everything finally pressed down too heavily on Clara's shoulders, she broke in a way she had been holding back since the moment the town forced her into Kota's hands. It happened quietly at first, a trembling breath, a quiver in her chest. But soon the dam she had built inside herself began to crack. Sitting alone inside her small tent, she pressed her hands over her mouth to muffle the sobs she couldn't stop, terrified that anyone hearing her would think her ungrateful or weak. Memories rushed at her like a flood. Her mother's warm kitchen, the dusty sunlight on her family's porch, the familiar creak of the wooden floorboards beneath her feet. All the little details of home crashed into her with merciless force, and Clara sank to the ground, knees pulled to her chest, shaking with grief and fear and the bitter sting of abandonment. She cried not just for the life she'd lost, but for the girl she used to be, the one who believed the world was kinder than it was. But while she believed she was suffering alone, she did not realize that someone had heard her, someone who had been paying far closer attention than she understood. Koda had been sitting by the fading fire outside, sharpening an arrowhead, when her muffled grief reached him. He froze, the desert wind brushing past like a whisper, before quietly setting the arrow aside. He didn't barge into her tent or call out her name. Instead, he approached slowly, his steps soft on the earth, and lowered himself to sit just outside the thin canvas wall separating them. He said nothing, not wanting to frighten her, not wanting to intrude, but his presence was like a warm, steady anchor in the storm of her tears. Clara felt his nearness before she heard it. The faint shift of the ground, the quiet rustle of clothing. It took her a long moment to register that he was keeping watch, that he was simply there, offering silent comfort in the gentlest way he knew. Minutes passed, perhaps hours, before her sobs softened, her breaths evening out into shaky, exhausted gasps. Finally, unsure if he had truly stayed, or if she was imagining the shape of him through the canvas, Clara pushed aside the tent flap just an inch, and there he was, sitting with his knees drawn up, hands resting loosely in front of him, his gaze lifting to hers with a warmth she had never seen on any face in her old town. He didn't ask what was wrong. He didn't offer empty promises, or try to pretend that her pain could vanish with a few words. Instead, in a low, steady voice, he said only, "You do not have to pretend with me." That simple sentence slipped past every wall she had built. It wasn't a command or a reassurance meant to silence her. It was an invitation, a quiet acknowledgement that he saw her struggle, that he didn't expect bravery she didn't have, that he understood fear in ways she couldn't yet imagine. And for the first time, Clara looked at him not as the man she had been forced to marry, but as someone who might understand her pain, someone who would not turn away. In that moment, something in her heart shifted, fragile as a new dawn but real enough that she felt it bloom in her chest, changing the shape of her fear into something gentler, something she didn't yet have a name for.
Clara's world tilted one quiet afternoon when she stumbled upon a truth she had never expected her, truth that changed everything she thought she knew about Coda, about her forced marriage, and about her own worth. It happened by accident. She had wandered a little beyond the camp, drawn to the peaceful solitude of a shaded ridge where wildflowers bloomed despite the desert heat. As she approached, she heard low voices, Coda S, and the Chief S speaking in tones that carried the weight of something not meant for her ears. She paused, half hidden behind a boulder, her breath catching when she recognized her own name woven into their conversation. She listened, at first out of fear, then out of growing disbelief. Coda was telling the chief that he had never wanted a bride handed to him like an object, nor did he believe in a marriage bound by force or politics. He spoke of Clara with quiet respect, admitting he had accepted the arrangement not because he desired a wife, but because her town demanded a trade to seal the fragile peace. If he had refused, bloodshed would have followed, more raids, more retaliation, more innocent lives lost on both sides. Clara realized, with a jolt that punched into her chest, that he had accepted her fate to prevent a war she had never been told about. What stunned her even more was how he spoke of her not as a burden, not as a prize, but as a human being caught in the crossfire of two worlds. "She is frightened," he said softly. "Her people lied to her about ours. She walks lightly, so she will not offend. She cries when she thinks I cannot hear." The chief replied that she was adjusting better than expected, but Coda only shook his head, his voice laced with a tenderness that made Clara's eyes sting. "She was taken from her home," he murmured. "I will not take anything else from her. She must be free to find her place, even if that place is not with me." Clara's breath shuddered out of her. Free, he was willing to let her go if she wished. This man, the one she had feared, the one her town had painted as a monster, was the only person who had given her a choice since the entire nightmare began. When Coda discovered her listening, he didn't react with anger or shame. He simply met her eyes with a calm acceptance, as though he had expected the truth to reach her eventually. Clara's voice trembled when she asked why he hadn't told her sooner. His answer was quiet, but shook her to the core. "Because I wanted you to see who I am not, what your town said I must be." That honesty, that gentle vulnerability, hit her harder than any kindness she had ever known. In that moment, Clara saw him with new clarity, not as the stranger she'd been forced to marry, but as the man who had chosen peace over pride and compassion over power. And as her heart trembled in her chest, she understood that something inside her had changed forever. As the days unfolded into warm, amberlit weeks, something inside Clara shifted so quietly she almost didn't notice it at first. The fear that had once clung to her like a second skin began to loosen, replaced by a cautious fascination with the man who treated her with more gentleness than anyone in her old life ever had. Coda did not press near her, did not assume rights over her, did not try to shape her into someone she was not. Instead, he simply existed beside her, steady, patient, present in a way that slowly rewrote how she saw him. She found herself watching him as he worked, the calm precision in his hands as he carved tools, the quiet concentration in his eyes when he tracked game, the way he truly listened when the elders spoke. When he laughed, which was rare but warm, it created a flutter in her chest she didn't know how to name. He was nothing like the men from her town who had judged her value by her dowry or her family standing. Coda saw people, not possessions. Even her, especially her. Their interactions grew more natural, almost easy. Coda taught her how to ride a horse without gripping the saddle in terror, how to read subtle signs in the sand that revealed where a rabbit had hopped or where the wind had shifted. His patience was unwavering, even when she failed or panicked, and he never mocked her mistakes. In turn, Clara found herself teaching him small English phrases, simple things at first, like thank you or good morning. The first time he tried to say good morning, the words stumbled out of his mouth, crooked and uncertain, and she laughed before she could stop herself. Coda didn't bristle or turn away. He smiled, a slow, rare thing that softened the hard edges of his face, and tried again. She realized then that she was no longer afraid of him. In fact, she found comfort in his presence. A reassurance in the quiet way he moved through the world, thoughtful and sure. One evening, as the sky melted into shades of crimson and gold, they walked together along a ridge overlooking the valley. The warm breeze lifted her hair, carrying the scent of sage and sun-baked earth. Coda's Arm brushed hers lightly, accidentally, and the touch sent a pulse straight through her heart. She stole a glance at him, wondering if he felt it too, but his expression was calm, contemplative eyes fixed on the horizon. And yet, his fingers lingered closer to hers than usual, as if he was slowly allowing himself to reach for her. Clara felt a strange ache bloom inside. Her something tender, trembling, impossibly hopeful. She had once believed her life with him would be a sentence, a chain she could never escape. But now, standing beside him in the fading light, she realized she no longer yearned for escape. Instead, she found herself wanting to understand him, to walk beside him, to learn the pieces of him he shared only in silence. By the time they returned to camp, one truth had taken root in her heart. Koda was no longer the man she feared. He was becoming the man she trusted. Perhaps even the man she was beginning to care for in ways she wasn't yet ready to admit aloud. And though neither of them spoke it, a quiet bond had begun to form between them, delicate but real, weaving itself through every shared moment and drawing them inevitably, gently, closer.
When word arrived that Clara's old town requested a meeting to ensure the Peace Bride was still alive and properly kept, a cold tremor ran through her. She remembered those faces too well. The townsfolk who had sent her away as though she were a bargaining chip, the men who had sneered that she should be grateful for the chance to be useful, the women who whispered that she was better off out of sight. They expected her to return in shame, miserable and desperate to come home. Clara dreaded their judgment, their pity, their smugness. The fear of facing them again coiled in her stomach, tighter with every hour that passed. But Kota noticed her trembling hands, the way she stared at the ground when the message was delivered. And instead of forcing her to go or dismissing her fear as weakness, he quietly set to work on something she didn't understand until the day of the meeting. For 3 days and nights, Koda worked with unwavering focus. He sought the help of the tribe's finest beadworkers, but he provided the design himself. Clara didn't know what he was creating, but she saw the intensity in his eyes, the purpose in each movement. When she tried to ask, he simply said, "It is for you," in a tone that carried a weight she didn't yet grasp. On the morning of the meeting, as the sun brushed the horizon with soft pink light, Kota approached her with something carefully folded over his arms. When he unfolded it, Clara's breath caught. It was a cloak intricately beaded, shimmering with colors that caught the morning sun like tiny jewels. But it wasn't simply beautiful, it was symbolic. Woven into the center was the mark reserved for women of honor in Koda's tribe, the symbol of someone respected, protected, and valued. Someone chosen. Clara's throat tightened. "I can't wear this," she whispered, overwhelmed. "I don't deserve." Koda shook his head gently. "It is not about deserving. It is truth." He draped the cloak around her shoulders with a reverence that made her eyes sting. "Let them see who you are here, not what they believed you to be." When they rode into town together, the reaction was immediate. Conversations faltered mid-sentence. Tools and baskets dropped from stunned hands. Every eye fixed on Clara, as the beaded cloak glowed in the sunlight, its symbols unmistakable. The girl they had thrown away, the girl they believed would be miserable and broken, returned standing tall beside an Apache warrior who showed her more honor than they ever had. Her father's face went pale. Her former suitor's mouth fell open. The town council exchanged looks of disbelief and discomfort. For the first time in her life, Clara felt the power of being seen, not as a burden or a sacrifice, but as someone cherished. She could feel Koda's presence beside her, steady and protective, but not possessive. He wasn't showing her off, he was defending her dignity. And in that stunned silence, Clara realized something profound. The life they had forced her into had become the life she would have chosen for herself. The cloak on her shoulders was more than a gift. It was a declaration. Promise. A turning point not just for the town watching her, but for her heart, which finally understood just how deeply Kota cared. The stunned silence of the town lingered in the air long after Kota and Clara dismounted but for the first time in her life Clara did not shrink beneath the weight of so many eyes. Wrapped in the beaded cloak, she felt a strength she had never known, born not from pride, but from finally understanding her own worth. Kota remained beside her, calm and steady, letting her step forward first. It was her moment, not his. When the town council approached, their voices tight with forced politeness, Clara listened without flinching as they attempted to question her treatment, her well-being, her place among the Apache. But the questions no longer held power over her. She raised her chin and answered firmly that she was respected, safe, and treated with more kindness than she had ever received in the place that claimed to be her home. Her father stepped forward, guilt flickering across his features as he reached for her. For a moment, Clara felt a faint ache of the old longing, the yearning for parental love she had chased her whole life. But when he asked if she wished to come back, Clara saw the truth clearly at last. They had never chosen her. They had chosen convenience, politics, and fear. Kota had chosen her. She took a slow breath, feeling the cloak's weight settle around her like a shield. "I have a home," she said quietly, "and it is not here." Her words struck harder than any weapon. Her father stepped back, as though stung, and murmurs rippled through the crowd, some shocked, some ashamed, some silently wishing they had seen her worth sooner. But Clara no longer sought their approval. She turned to Kota, meeting his gaze with a steadiness that made warmth pool in his eyes. He had never asked for her loyalty, never demanded affection, never claimed rights to her heart. Yet he had earned it slowly, gently, with every act of quiet honor he'd offered her. On the ride back to the Apache camp, the desert wind whispered around them, carrying away the remnants of her old life like dust in sunlight. Clara leaned slightly toward Kota, not out of fear or uncertainty, but out of choice. He glanced back at her, and something softened in his expression, not surprise, not doubt, but the quiet joy of a man who had hoped without expecting. When they arrived at camp, Clara slid down from the horse and turned to him before he could walk away. "Kota," she said softly, her voice trembling with truth, "I choose this. One choose you not because I must, but because I want to." For the first time, the calm, reserved warrior let emotion flicker openly across his face. He reached toward her slowly, giving her every chance to step back. When she didn't, he gently touched her cheek, his thumb brushing away a tear she hadn't felt fall. "Then my heart is full," he murmured. The tribe welcomed her return with warm smiles, but Clara barely saw them. Her world had narrowed to the man before her, the man who had turned her fate on its head, not with power or demands, but with compassion. As the sun dipped behind the mountains, painting the sky in golden ember, Clara realized she was no longer the terrified girl who had been forced into a stranger's arms. She was a woman who had found her own path, one shaped by courage, respect, and a love that blossomed, not from force, but from freedom. And standing beside Kota, wrapped in the cloak he had made with his own hands, she knew with absolute certainty this was the life she had been meant for all along.